All right, pre-AP biology. We're going to continue today with our unit on biochemistry. Previously, I had a couple of videos about just like basic chemistry concepts. Things like the periodic table and element symbols and um, bonding and water and things like that. In these notes, I want to focus today on organic compounds, organic chemistry. You might remember from um, earlier in the year, we talked about the characteristics of life, and one of the things that we mentioned is that living things, contain organic compounds. So I think it's kind of worth today to talk a little bit about what organic compounds are, and some of these things that make up living things, some of the organic compounds that are found in all living things. All right, so let's first talk a little bit about carbon because organic, basically is carbon chemistry. So, one thing that you should probably be a little bit familiar with is carbon's position on the periodic table. If you have a periodic table with you, I gave you guys one in class. Take it. You might want to pause the video here and just locate where carbon is. So carbon, has that atomic number of 6, which means in the middle, right, you've got 6 protons, but you also have 6 electrons outside, right? So you might remember from last week, we said that there's 2 of those electrons go in the first orbital, and then the other 4 go in the second. Even though the second orbital can hold up to 8, there's only 4 to put out there. So carbon's kind of an interesting atom because it kind of can do a couple of things. I mean, it could gain 4 electrons, right? It could lose 4 electrons. It can share electrons. There's a lot of things that carbon can actually do. Um, and that's one of the reasons why it kind of is an atom that can form so many different compounds. I mean, it can form single bonds, double bonds, triple bonds. I mean, there are literally thousands and thousands of compounds that all have carbon as kind of that core atom because so many other things can bond to it. So it's kind of the basis of organic compounds. Just remember, organic, carbon based. More specifically, it's carbon and carbon bonded together, but other things as well can bond to these carbon atoms. All right, now for this class, I'm going to keep it really simple. If you take AP biology someday, you will learn a lot more about this stuff. I'm just going to touch on the basics, in these notes. But all living things have 4 different types of organic compounds. And you've probably heard of some of these things like carbohydrates, lipids, or fats, proteins, and then finally something called nucleic acids. Now, one of the things that you're going to have to know is that each one of these types of organic compounds um, is made up of sort of a building block. We call it a monomer. A monomer is kind of the subunit that makes up each one. For example, carbohydrates have their own subunit, lipids have their own subunit. Think of the subunits. Think of like a brick house, right? The brick would be the subunit. Okay, so all 4 of these things are like different types of brick houses made of different types of bricks, and those monomers are the bricks. Okay, if that makes any sense to you. All right, so let's talk about carbohydrates. Carbohydrates, when we think of carbohydrates, a lot of times we think about food, right? Things that we eat. There's a reason why carbohydrates make up a huge component of our diets, and that's because basically they provide energy for us. The monomer that makes up a carbohydrate is called a sugar unit or a sugar. And one thing I want you to know about sugars is that there are 3 elements in a sugar. You need to know these: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And not only that, but they appear in a 1:2 to 1 ratio. So, for example, right, this is glucose, right? You'll notice that it's carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. and there's a 1:2 to 1 ratio of those three elements. Now, sometimes you'll see it written like this, kind of written as a compound, with symbols and subscripts, whatever. Sometimes you'll see it. You'll see the structural diagram, and like for example, if you look at something like this, you're like, well, what does all this mean? These lines represent bonds. So like this carbon atom here is bonded to this carbon, and then this carbon is bonded to this oxygen. So I mean, we're not going to go crazy into that, but one thing you'll notice about it is if you count up the carbons, right? You've got one carbon, two, three, four, five, six. There's six carbon atoms there. If you count up the hydrogens, there's 12. And if you count up the oxygens, there's six. So this is actually representing a glucose molecule. So you should be able to look at a structural diagram like that, and you should be able to count up atoms. And if it's carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in a 1:2 to 1 ratio, then you've got yourself a carbohydrate. Now, there's a couple different general categories of carbohydrates. One of them is called a simple sugar. They're also known as monosaccharides and disaccharides. Mono means one, di means two. And these are carbohydrates that have just a few sugar units that are involved. Usually they taste very sweet. Sweet tasting sugars are typically your simple sugars. They provide quick energy for your cells. Some good examples are sucrose, which is table sugar, and glucose, which is plant sugar. We also have something called polysaccharides. Remember, poly means many. So these are complex sugars. The term saccharide means sugar, by the way. A few examples of this are starches, which are found in things like potatoes and corn. Cellulose, which is found in a lot of plants. In fact, the cell walls of plants is made up of cellulose. Anytime you eat a plant, whether it be lettuce or whatever, you're eating cellulose. Glycogen. Glycogen is animal starch. We actually store this in our bodies. We actually store it in our livers. And when our blood sugar gets too low, our liver will release it into our bloodstream. Your pancreas and your liver kind of talk to each other to allow that to happen. Um, insulin's involved and all that type of stuff. This is one of the reasons why people who are diabetic, they're having trouble controlling their blood sugar levels. That's because their liver is not releasing that sugar when they need it. And that can be problematic. So again, these are more like long-term energy storage types of things. Like for example, let's say before a swim meet or something, you wouldn't go and eat a whole bowl of mashed potatoes, right? You probably would want to eat some quick energy, maybe some disaccharides or monosaccharides. You wouldn't want to eat a polysaccharide because it takes your body a little bit longer to break those things down, and you might get sick, for example, if you get in and want to swim or something. All right, lipids. Again, lipids, when we think about them, lipids are fats. We think about things like potato chips and butter and things like that. The monomer that makes up lipids is called a fatty acid. Um, just remember that term. We'll talk more about it in a minute. But fatty acids are basically big, long chains of two elements, carbon and hydrogen. On the next screen, the next couple screens, I'll show you what these look like. Lipids are typically not soluble in water, which means they don't dissolve in water. Some good examples of lipids are things like fats, oils, waxes as well. Some of the more important importances of lipids. One of them is long-term energy storage. Fats and lipids have a lot more energy than sugars do. So these lipids, they can be stored for long periods of time, much more so than carbohydrates can. They're a major component of cell membranes. So think about your cells. Every cell in your body has a cell membrane around it, and it's actually made up of fats, of lipids. So if your cells need to be repaired or they're damaged or something, then you need fats to repair cells. Here, for example, this is a neuron. If you look on the bottom left here, this is like a brain cell or a nerve cell. And this kind of yellow part right here, this is called myelin. myelin. We'll talk more about myelin a little bit later on in the year, but that myelin is actually made up of fat. And it's kind of like the insulation on a wire, like a plastic coating around a wire. So for example, when your nerves are sending information from one part of your body to the next, it travels along this pathway, and it's actually insulated by that fatty coating. So that's actually a really important thing. If we didn't have that fatty coating, then our nerves couldn't communicate with other parts of our body, and that would be very difficult. Sex hormones. These are used to make sperm and egg cells. Believe it or not, fats and lipids are actually used in the production of sperm and eggs. Here's one that's kind of an interesting one: earwax and sebaceous oil. Earwax, and we think like, okay, all that stuff that's in our ears, right? Like we think it's just kind of gross, so we take our Q-tips and we get it out of there every day, right? But that stuff actually is pretty important. It actually helps to um, stop any type of infection from getting into your inner ear canal. So that earwax actually has an importance. Sebaceous oil is actually created by your skin cells. If you've ever like gone, let's say 24 hours or so without taking a shower, kind of rub your fingers through your hair or like rub your hand along your skin, it'll feel like really oily and kind of greasy. That's because your skin cells are actually making this sebaceous oil to actually help ward off infection. I mean, it's actually kind of an important thing. I mean, think about our ancestors, millions of years ago, roaming the African plains. They didn't have any soap. They didn't have showers. They had to depend on their body's own way to kind of clean itself off. So that sebaceous oil has been something that that's kind of been that has stuck with us, through thousands and thousands and thousands of years of evolution. All right, a couple things about fatty acids I want to just kind of pinpoint out to you here, myself up here real quick. I want you to know a little bit of the chemistry behind a fatty acid or behind a kind of a lipid structure. Here we have two different types of fatty acids. This one at the top is called a saturated fat, and the one on the bottom is called an unsaturated fat. I want to kind of show you just some of the similarities and differences between the two. First of all, you'll notice um, in both structures, you notice that there's like a carbon atom here, and it's kind of double bonded to an oxygen. There's a single bond to an oxygen here, and then there's another hydrogen. So basically, you've got a carbon atom, two oxygens, and a hydrogen. Same thing at the top, right? Even in a saturated fat, you see the same structure. Okay, that's called a glycerol unit. And every fatty acid has that glycerol. That's kind of one way that you can kind of tell that it's a fatty acid. Now, the other thing that you see is this big long chain of carbon and hydrogen atoms, right? I mean, you just got all these carbons linked to each other and a bunch of hydrogens, right? Same thing down here. You got a bunch of carbons. Now you see a little double bond there. We'll come back to that in a minute. And then you got a bunch of hydrogens, right? I mean, those are called hydrocarbons. The one big difference between the two is that an unsaturated fat has a double bond, whereas a saturated fat has all of these single bonds in its hydrocarbon structure. That's kind of what separates the two from each other. All right, so I want to go through just kind of a compare and contrast list of saturated versus unsaturated fats. So again, saturated, they don't have any double bonds. They lack those double bonds. Unsaturated, oops, sorry. Unsaturated has double bonds. Sometimes they have more than one. If they do, they're called polyunsaturated, but don't worry so much about that. Saturated fats are typically solids at room temperature, things like butter, for example. Okay, whereas unsaturated fats are liquids at room temperature. Saturated fats mainly come from animal sources. Again, things like butter, red meat, eggs, those have a lot of saturated fats. Whereas unsaturated mainly come from plants sources, things like nuts and vegetables, oils, and avocados are a good example of an unsaturated or have a lot of unsaturated fat. Now, one of the biggest things I want you to know about saturated versus unsaturated is that if you have a diet that's really high in saturated fats, that has a tendency to raise something called your bad cholesterol. Bad cholesterol is also known as LDL cholesterol. The thing with LDL cholesterol is it tends to build up in your body in high amounts. It sticks to your arteries. It's called plaque. It can lead to heart disease. Whereas unsaturated fats actually tend to lower that bad cholesterol. So, I mean, people always say, "Oh, we shouldn't eat a bunch of fats." Well, I mean, unsaturated fats are actually not too bad for you because they actually do have tendency to lower that bad cholesterol. Yeah, we don't want to consume too many fats of either type, but the unsaturated seems to be the better type as far as monitoring and lowering that bad cholesterol in our bodies. All right, proteins. We're gonna whiz through this one really quick. Um, Proteins, the monomer is called an amino acid. You've probably heard of amino acids before. There's actually 20 different types. No, you don't have to memorize them. But again, think of these amino acids as like Lego bricks. Imagine you put a whole bunch of Lego bricks in the middle of the floor and you just start building things. You can build something as simple as like a little tiny car or something, that might take you 10 minutes. Or you can build something like the Millennium Falcon out of Legos, which would take you like, days to do. But you can build a variety of different structures. Now, amino acids have nitrogen in them, in addition to carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. So that's one big difference between proteins and some of the other things that we've talked about before. But again, one difference between, let's say one protein and the next is just, what are the amino acids that are making up the protein? How many of them are there? I mean, for example, the Millennium Falcon here, that thing is made up of a heck of a lot more Lego bricks than this little car is. Maybe even some different types of Lego bricks compared to this one. So proteins are the same. I mean, this protein here, let's say this is a protein, it's made up of some different amino acids than this protein is. All right, so hopefully we kind of understand that. Now, proteins play different roles in living things. One of the roles that they play is something called a structural component. For example, one type of protein is called collagen. So it gives strength to your skin. So you can like pinch your cheek, you can like stretch your skin out. The older you get, the more that protein tends to break down. So like older people, their skin is a little bit more leathery, not quite as smooth and stretchy as like a younger person's would be. Keratin, this is another one. This is what gives structure to your hair and your fingernails. In fact, if you've ever smelled like burnt hair, it has a very distinguishable odor to it. That's the keratin that's inside of your hair. It's a protein that's in your hair. Transport, hemoglobin is a good example. This is a protein that actually transports, oxygen and carbon dioxide around your body. And also, proteins act as what we call enzymes. Enzymes are proteins that help to speed up reactions. A really good example is a protein called amylase. Amylase is found in your saliva. When if I try this at home, if you guys are got a few minutes today, go into your refrigerator and get a piece of bread. It's like a piece of white bread or something, um, and just kind of wad it up into a ball, and put it in your mouth and to start chewing on it. All right. I mean, I guarantee you will not be able to swallow that thing in like 30 seconds because your saliva has this enzyme that actually helps to break down sugars. And that's what the bread basically is a sugar. So it's what that saliva is doing, what that amylase is doing, is it's speeding up the digestion process. If we didn't have amylase, we couldn't digest any sugars in our mouth, and that would be really hard to chew bread and break it down into smaller particles. So that would be kind of difficult to do. All right, the last thing here today is nucleic acids. I'm going to make this one really brief because we're going to talk so much about it in a couple of weeks. Nucleic acids, the monomer is called a nucleotide. Just remember the name right now. There's not really much more I'm going to talk about with it. But probably the most common nucleic acid is DNA, right? DNA is found on your chromosomes, it's inherited from your parents, it controls all of our traits. Every living thing has nucleic acids. DNA is the most common one, even though there are other types of nucleic acids, but DNA is probably the one that gets the most publicity. We'll talk about some of the other ones down the road as well. All right, so that's it for today, guys. Just quick review. Four types of organic molecules. These are called macromolecules, but make sure we know the four different types, and make sure we know those subunits that are involved. All right, guys, have a good day. I'll see you soon.